Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Javed Mofagian Cinema. My name is Am Johal. I work here at SFU's Van City Office of Community Engagement for the discussion this evening, foreign investment in real estate in Vancouver. I've been collaborating with Gordon Price from the City Program and also Peter Ladner, who's also joined us up there. Want to say a few words, Gordon?
Yeah. Thanks, Am. Am and I are part of the Engaged University. That's what we do at Simon Fraser. And actually, we're part of a much larger organization that is very much involved in mounting events like this. We've got City Conversation coming up tomorrow at Harper Center. We're going to be doing an all-candidates meeting on transportation. There are lots of things. Maybe you have some as well.
Yeah, this coming Sunday, we're going to be doing the first annual Jim Green Memorial Opera Series with the Vancouver Opera. It's going to be a free screening of Carmen on Sunday at 2 p.m. And for all the other events going on, including the Projecting Change Film Festival in April to the Indian Summer Festival in July, you can go on to sfuwoodwards.ca for the range of cultural and community program that we have happening out of this building. I'll leave it to Gordon.
Great. So this is the first time Am and I have worked together. It's been terrific, and here we all are. And we got to talking. We'd like to find out a little bit from you. First of all, some things on etiquette. You see all these seats here that are empty? They're not supposed to be. People signed up for them, right? We had a full house, and they don't show up. Now, that is a bit of a problem for us because there are people who couldn't come, who would have, and it's getting very hard for us to estimate how much to overbook. So, we bemoan this, and we'd ask, certainly you're good people, you're here. But if you do sometimes sign up for a free event at Simon Fraser and you can't make it, let us know. And if you know someone who should have been in one of those seats, give them the look. And speaking of the look, we want to know a little bit about this. Now, you've heard how many times? It can't ring. So do whatever you need to. And everybody else, if it ever happens, is entitled to look at that person and give them Canadian shame. That'll do it. So more and more people aren't leaving their phones on to ring, but we've got some interesting questions for you. How many of you would like to be tweeting here or recording?
Tweeting is not a good
thing. Tweeting? Did I say tweaking? No. Tweeting. Really? Just about a half dozen of you? How many other find when people are using their phones and they're lit up that it's a bit annoying or distracting? I'm not asking you to guilt those people out. Just a sense of, this is all new etiquette for people who manage things like this. So not so many. Basically, most of you are telling me that's okay. All right, how many of you would really like to have Wi-Fi in this room if we provided it? Ooh. Would you even be willing to pay for it? Not so much. No, I understand. That's kind of comes with it. You would be prepared to pay for it.
How much? Like, I pay it.
Oh, you're the economist. Okay. We'll let the market decide. Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. And again, if you've got any other kind of observations you'd like to make, contemporary etiquette, that would be terrific. Now, you want me to introduce Jim?
Yeah.
Okay. My job to introduce our host. Thank you so much, Jim Sutherland, for agreeing to do this. A few things about Jim, journalist. And for those of you who have lived in Vancouver for any length of time and have been reading about this place, are fascinated with how it changes, I think it's fair to say that James Sutherland has produced a body of work which retrospectively really is incredibly informative, certainly about real estate, but he takes it into other aspects of what it means for us as a people, a culture, and a place. Is that fair to say, Jim? Well, that's how I'd say it. And something you might not know about him, he's an athlete. He still, fast pitch?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. To the point where he actually goes around the province in tournaments? Mm-hmm. He's an athlete. So if any of you act up, Jim's got the muscle. So it's a pleasure to turn it over to Jim now at this point to introduce the panel and to conduct the evening. Am and I thank you for coming, and hopefully we'll be doing something similar like this in the future.
Thanks so much, Gordon. It's clear that you should probably be running this panel tonight. But the other thing I instantly recognize in looking around this room is that real estate really is a civic sport. to get 300 people out on a rainy Tuesday to talk about real estate is really pretty amazing. I'm just going to ever so briefly describe the format tonight. We're going to start with our three panelists, whom I'm going to introduce in just a minute. They're each going to speak for about 15 minutes. And then we're going to have another 15 or 20 minutes amongst ourselves to challenge each other's beliefs and assumptions. And then we're going to turn it over to you. And when we do that, we hope that everyone will be very, very civil, because we do believe there will be some lots of questions and lots of good questions, and we certainly do welcome those. So without further ado, let's look at our panel. To my immediate left and going first, we have Andy Yan. Andy is a native Vancouverite, and his title is he's a senior urban planner with the Bing Tom Architects and a researcher with BTA Works. And what that really means is that he probably has the funkiest job in Vancouver. Bing Tom, as everyone knows, is really one of our leading architecture firms, and they're incredibly busy, but every now and then they have a little lull. And a lot of other architectural firms, when that happens, people get laid off, or but at Bing Tom, they just let Andy do whatever he wants when he has no time, when there's nothing else for him to do. And so he's done some amazing things. No one else was studying the effects of climate warming on Vancouver, what rising sea levels might mean. So he did. No one else. Everyone was talking about the empty high-rises downtown, but nobody did anything about it. So Andy did that. He was the one who discovered that, in fact, only about 5% roughly of our downtown high-rises are empty, which is pretty much the norm for high-rises anywhere in the world. So let's just agree that Andy has the funkiest job in Vancouver. Moving down, we have Sandy Garrosino. And Sandy, I've just met Sandy tonight, and I think she's probably on more boards than anyone else in Vancouver. Just looking at her very short resume here, and I'm sure she's left some out. She's another native Vancouverite, family in the transportation business. She's a former lawyer, Crown prosecutor, who now apparently left that just to sit on boards. Among her boards are just a few. She's on the SFU India Advisory Council. She's on UBC's Asia Strategy through their Institute for Asian Research. She's been a board member of the Writers' Festival, the Public Dream Society, and the Alliance for Arts and Culture, and on and on and on. So we'll look forward to hearing from Sandy. At the end, we have Tsur Somerville. Tsur is not a native Vancouverite. His father was a native Vancouverite and moved to Berkeley to do his graduate degree, met his future wife, Tsur's mom, settled in Berkeley, and somehow, and I don't really know how this happened, Tsur ended back here. I guess he got offered a job, because now he works at UBC, where he's a professor in the economics department, specializing in real estate. And what is it he told me he would do? He said he would aggressively challenge consumptions without any data whatsoever. So we have a lot of things to look forward to tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andy.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Am and Gord, for inviting me to talk about foreign investment in Vancouver's real estate. When kind of posed with this kind of question, my initial reaction was, it's really, really hard to measure, and I can best give you some proxy measures, and I'm done. Over to you, Tsur and Sandy. But in lieu of that, really, I think this presentation that I'll give is I think, hopefully alluring in some updates based upon our original work in 2008 that really, I think, really kind of, I hope will shed some light, if not actually hope maybe entertain you in the next 15 minutes, that really brings in a discussion about, I think, foreign investment affordability, and really the state of the city. So moving forward, I think really it's kind of important to recognize that foreign investment in Vancouver is historical, that there is a presence of very clear foreign investment in the city. And here's an example that, there was an investment about $95 million yes, you should be seeing something. There we go. Here's the something. We'll be doing a puppet show after this. But that from this initial discussion, that here's an example of foreign investment in play in the region. That here's a project that was $95 million in 2012. That really it was an investment from probably one of the more powerful large multinational conglomerates of its time, and that really it opened up a massive portion of Metro Vancouver for a very high-end and exclusive residential development. And what was that? It's Lions Gate Bridge. That in 1937, the Guinness family, as in this Guinness, that this Guinness family decided to make an investment play in Vancouver, which of course developed the British properties, and which was approximately actually 22 square kilometers of West Vancouver. So it's kind of in this initial historic context that I bring forward a talk about what is foreign investment. And really one of the challenges it's how do we define it? How do we measure it? And really, when you look at the data that I've been able to access, it comes into even this question. Well, who in, say, this picture is foreign? How do you know it's foreign? And so this kind of brings in this kind of challenge of, well, what is foreign and what is domestic, and how do we make the difference? And so really, it's kind of in this environment of uncertainty that I bring forward this presentation. And so a lot of this presentation, again, is based upon an analysis as well as reanalysis of data we did in a May 2009 study that we did on ownership, occupancy, and rentals in downtown Vancouver. And I also like to recognize Eileen Keenan, who's actually my cohort, the smarter side of BTA Works here. Hi, Eileen. And that from here, really we wanted to kind of understand, how did we get from here, this picture of downtown Vancouver in 1985, to here? And the kind of remarkable tectonic changes that were involved on an economic, on an urban level, and really kind of what were some of those elements that are not necessarily visible towards those towards city building today. And so we kind of continued on with this examination of downtown condos as part of the drivers towards development in downtown Vancouver. And so our data sources were BC Assessment, which gave us ownership data, the homeowners grant, which confirmed BC assessment data, but then also problematized it, and we'll talk about that later. BC Hydro, which gave us a sense of what empty condos were. And indeed, this kind of matches the kind of a discourse that occurred, about 8 years ago about the prevalence of empty condos. And really what we wanted to do was, what might some of the best methods of measuring empty condos might be? And really a qualitative review of looking at the minutes of stratas and regulations and seeing how that all fit in. An excellent exercise in examining how passive aggressiveness works in this city, by the way. And so putting this within a context of existing research by the Canada Mortgage Corporation, Statistics Canada, and the City of Vancouver's data and research team. So defining our study area was that we focused on downtown Vancouver, excluding the West End. And this is actually a very important research note, is that we exclude the West End for a number of reasons, and you'll see it later on in our data that you'll see how uniquely different urbanism is between the West End and downtown Vancouver. So it's this area bounded between West Georgia, Burrard, and to the east by Maine from water to water. And our sample really was an attempt to kind of have an indicative sample of condominium buildings, the towers in particular, to represent really what was there in 2008. That we wanted to also get a spatial representation of the area. That we like to think that most of the neighborhoods in downtown Vancouver, from Cole Harbour to downtown South, Yaletown, Concord Pacific, was represented in our samples. So this formed the basis of our study, and just looking at behaviors of ownership became a major element of this paper. And here's actually where I need to step aside and say there's a foundational assumption in these studies. Anytime you see a study looking at ownership, and particularly the separation between owner occupancy and investor owned, and it comes to the following: that if the assessment ticket, particularly using assessment data, goes to the address that's being assessed, it's assumed as owner-occupied. if the ticket gets sent somewhere else, it is assumed to be investor-owned. And that this is a key assumption that pretty much our paper focuses on. And when you look at that and our population, you're looking at virtually a 50-50 split for our downtown condos, which was about 2,400 in the sample size, and it was split between investor-owned and owner-occupied. And so kind of beginning with this kind of base, the following are kind of reanalyses, recent ones. And Gord, you made me work hard the last week, and really a kind of new analysis on data that we had first culled in 2008. And of course, things have changed, and really perhaps someday I hope to really update this to kind of see how things have changed. But really, method number one is looking at where these assessment tickets are sent. And where are they being sent? Well, the mass majority is to Canada, followed by the United States, China, Japan, Hong Kong, the United Kingdom, and then the rest of the world. Now, one might make the immediate assumption that, well, there's no foreign ownership, but that's not necessarily true, nor does it show that there is foreign ownership, that for all we know, that ticket being sent to China is going to a Canadian, or that ticket that's going to the UK is going to somebody who just decided to work there and just wanted the whole property over there. That's perhaps not a national, not a Canadian national. So this is, of course, one very popular method, but it doesn't necessarily confirm citizenship and hence the kind of foreignness. So one kind of neat thing is actually when one kind of begins to look at, let's look internally and see where these tickets are being sent. And of course, the vast majority is being sent within the region. And what's neat about this map is that it identifies where the assessment ticket's being sent. And really, if you kind of superimpose a kind of imagine, but I think it's pretty straightforward, geography of wealth in the city and in the region, that, you see a certain proportion showing up on the west side of Vancouver, West Vancouver, North Vancouver. And that wouldn't be too far off from initial observations, because you find that Vancouver, that 42% of those condos are owned by people living in the city of Vancouver, and also and in the surrounding parts, they're in a neck-and-neck race between North Vancouver, West Vancouver, and Burnaby, followed by Surrey. So it's an idea that at least in this first step of looking at where tickets are sent within the region, that you see it's being kept in the region. But what we don't know is, again, the citizenship of these households, like who's actually in these households. Are they actually the first tier of somebody holding another home somewhere else? So this kind of begins to problematize it, I hope. But another kind of side note is that 25% of these assessment tickets for our study population, when they're investor-owned, go out of the region. But within the total population, the top cities to pop up are Calgary at 1% and Edmonton at another 1%. I have to be honest here, if I showed you the municipal flags of these cities, you probably wouldn't recognize them, but I'm just being a pragmatist, okay? So moving forward, finding foreign method number two. And it's really looking at ownership types that, hey, maybe, when they're owned by corporations or being sent to a strata firm, that's perhaps a sign that they're foreign. Well, this is how it kind of breaks down for our sample, that indeed 49% are owner-occupied, which we knew earlier, that 43% are being sent to individuals that just aren't living in these units, and 2% are being sent to management firms, and 6% are being sent to a firm, that there's actually a firm that is off-site that is receiving those famous numbered corporations are examples of where these tickets are being sent. But again, not a particularly great measure of foreignness. That for all we know, there is actually a good number of foreigners, perhaps, that are living and living in their own places that are owner occupied. But it kind of begins again the issue of challenge of measuring the issue of foreignness. So kind of moving to the presentation that, we're here to talk about foreign investment in Vancouver real estate. And I hope so far you've realized that it isn't as easy to measure foreign investment in Vancouver real estate as it is to perhaps talk about foreign investment in Vancouver real estate. So kind of best to talk about what you do know, and what I do know is there's some interesting things when we take out the foreign and talk about investment in Vancouver real estate. So that in the kind of forthcoming slides, you'll see kind of our brief explorations of investment in Vancouver real estate. So how many units are investor-owned versus owner-occupied out of our sample? Well, about 50 to 60% were owner-occupied. And that fuzz factor, I think, really is an interesting kind of phenomenon. And we've been kind of struggling in trying to figure out, well, why that fuzz factor, and perhaps members of the audience can suggest why that fuzz factor occurs. And I'll show you why that. What is that fuzz factor and how it came about, and perhaps what some of the reasons might be. So again, our friend from BC Assessment, that 50% of the time it goes to it's investor owned, 50% of the time effectively it's owner occupied. But when we look at, and this is once in a while, it's always great to have an affirmation. And the affirmation is from a study that Tsur was part of. And part of this is a much larger study done by the city of Vancouver that was based upon 66,000 condos as opposed to 2,400 in our study. And in that study, and this is actually a great report that's published by the city of Vancouver that was done by City Spaces and Urban Futures. Incidentally, if you come to btaworks.com, we have a bibliography that you can access all these studies, plus I think a few interesting urban writers that I think to kind of contextualize Vancouver. But what you find in that kind of larger study was that there was more or less a 48-52 split between owner occupancy and investor owned. I like to think statistically the same, more or less. Ish, check with you.
Well, it all depends on what you're defining as downtown. I'm actually the one, those are actually my data that I gave, I crunched for them, so I'm completely responsible for these numbers.
Okay.
So you can blame me.
Pass off with Tsur. So what's interesting?
I don't consider that any kind of difference because we're looking at different years too, right? Sure. This is 2009 data, you were looking at 2008. It's
one year. But I think what's neat about that data set that you did, Tsur, is actually the geographic differences and how geography matters. And that depending on which neighborhood you're looking at, that ownership percentage actually changes. And I think that that's an interesting conversation towards the discussion of real estate and housing and how different geographies change and how that might contextualize a discussion about housing and investment. And really, from there, taking a step back to the homeowners grant database, that for our sample, we found that to qualify for a homeowners grant, which is another way of kind of talking about our data set, that you have to receive a homeowners grant, you have to be a principal residence for an owner, you have to be a Canadian citizen or landed immigrant, but your property has to be less than effectively $1.2 million for your house to qualify for a homeowner's grant. So when we kind of take these factors in, what we find within our population set, which drops by about 200 properties, is that 60% receive a homeowner's grant versus 40% 60% do not receive a homeowner's grant versus 40% that do receive a homeowner's grant. And I think that was kind of interesting to note because when you compare them beside each other, that it was unexpected. We didn't particularly expect it, and we were trying to figure out, well, really, why is there a difference between, say, those who might qualify for a homeowner's grant not to get one, that there is this kind of strange 10%. And why? Because I had actually, frankly, my sense of human nature is rather negative, that I had actually thought that there'd be people claiming a homeowner's grant who wouldn't qualify for a homeowner's grant, but then it seemed to be the other way around. And was this the fact that they didn't know about the homeowner's grant, they could afford not joining the homeowner's grant, but really perhaps maybe they weren't citizens and that they didn't qualify along those citizenship levels. So that's a kind of interesting mystery that we've been kind of trying to figure out, because we were working with somebody from the City of Vancouver's Housing Center who has since retired, and just to kind of see, well, what was happening with this 10% difference. So kind of moving there, what's interesting is looking what happens when you kind of look at size. And really, smaller units have always been and the kind of diversity within these patterns. Smaller units have often been cited as kind of the first step for first-time homeowners to enter the market and then ride the ladder. And really, in our study, we looked at we isolated units that were under 425 square feet, which these days with micro suites is huge. That it was 110 units. Our sample size does get smaller, but what's kind of neat is actually looking at that distribution, that what you find is actually a lot of investor-owned smaller units compared to owner-occupied units. And I think what this does, and I think it does, is it problematizes the discussion that smaller units automatically means affordability for the first-time homeowner. I think that there's an assumption there that I think is worth testing, that I'm not particularly sure, because if I think what happens is that you have first-time homeowners competing with investors. And how does that competition end up, and who wins and who loses, I think, is perhaps part of another study. And finally, on our kind of method number 3, based upon this data set, we looked at the issue of empty condos as a kind of indicator of, well, hey, these are people who are so wealthy, they keep them empty. And really what we did was we looked at, we consulted with BC Hydro, and we looked, and we got a definition that if an empty unit was something that used less than 75 kilowatt hours. And what was that? Well, it was the amount that an average refrigerator uses in a month to maintain itself. And that really the average unit, at least according to BC Hydro back then, was 400 kilowatt hours. So you can see a big difference between how much a unit would be using on the average versus one that's just running or less than running a refrigerator. But then, of course, there's a number of reasons why a condominium would be empty. That perhaps it's people moving, it's in between owners and tenants, that it has seasonal occupancy, and of course, it's an investment holding. So, and of course, our data set was based upon a month, upon 2 years and a month-to-month average. So just to kind of, again, note the methodology of our study. And really, what did we find? We found that at that 75%, the 75 kilowatt hour threshold, that 5.5% of units suggested that they were empty. That 100 kilowatts, you see that it was 8.5% that were possibly empty. And then also at 150 kilowatts, that 17% were suggested that their hydro rates were empty. And I think part of this was we wanted to kind of give a range as opposed to a magic bullet to kind of understand really the diversity, the kind of give that perhaps could occur towards determining something that is empty or not. And again, checking with other studies, that a study done in 2004 by the City of Vancouver, which kind of followed more the 100 kilowatt range, suggested that 8 to 9% of downtown condos were empty using their thresholds. So it's from there that we looking at, well, what does the new, say, 2011 census say about condos, investment in condos? And so we experimented with looking at this following population. And bear with me, the famous chart of how categories work, that what we wanted to do was kind of see what the count might be for these two categories. And because they're also clunked in together, that unfortunately we weren't able to break it apart. But based upon other data sets from 2001 and 2006, it suggested that most of the time it was dominated by unoccupied units as opposed to occupied solely by foreign residents and or by temporary present persons, which frankly, at the end of the day, this is really talking about that population using Airbnb. So that using this measure, we were just curious to see, well, what kinds of numbers are we generating? What types of patterns do we see? And on a kind of macroscopic level, on a kind of looking at the top 25 largest cities in Canada, that this is what the pattern broke out as. That Windsor, Ontario has the highest percentage of non-resident occupied regular dwelling units, which I guess in one way is unoccupied. One can shorthand and call them unoccupied, followed by London, Vancouver, Edmonton, and Halifax. So it's kind of, again, understanding geographic diversity, that, they spread from sea to sea. One city represents, well, Canada's Detroit and the kind of requisite challenges that involves. One represents supposedly the greatest place on earth, and then Halifax, I guess, and that one also represents a kind of changing dynamic urban environment like Surrey, which is seeing a lot of houses being held over for development to a higher density. And it's from there. What's again important is geography, and within that geography, and here's the average for the city of for this 25 city sample. That what you see is geographic diversity, because when we focus on just the city of Vancouver, we find that really the city of Vancouver is, again, geographically diverse. That when you look at neighborhoods, say, outside the downtown core, they're about average. and that basically on the citywide average is about 7.7%, and I colored this along lines to kind of show what was at average and what was above average, and just to kind of show the differences and really how concentrated it is in downtown Vancouver. And it's from here that we focus further into the slides that into the geography, that you find that, well, when we focus in on, say, downtown Vancouver, that there is even a further diversity. That I don't know if you can see it there, that places like Cole Harbour actually have a, well, non-resident occupancy rate of about 22%, and which almost is 1 in 4 units suggest, using this measure, that they were non-resident occupied versus other parts of downtown. And what's kind of and this is a little bit surprising just to kind of see this type of pattern. And again, I'd be very curious to see what people might think on the panel as well as in the audience, that how much of this is a measurement problem, that it's the instrument that we're measuring, and how much of this is actually a phenomenon that people see and experience. That, if you will, you folks out in the audience can ground truth a lot of statistics that perhaps being obsessive over a screen may not necessarily precede that insight. So when we kind of focus on, and just to contextualize those non-resident occupancy rates that at least the CMHC was reporting for downtown Vancouver, it was 1.3%, just to kind of show what was being kept vacant. And really looking at really the amount of empty condos using this methodology, as you kind of look at this downtown area, that about 15% were suggested that they were unoccupied, that they were non-resident occupied. So it's kind of from here I'm going to finish with this map. And I think through this presentation, you see the kind of challenges that there aren't necessarily great methods of measuring foreign investment in Vancouver real estate. There aren't really direct measures, unless Tsur can perhaps clarify that there might be. That really it's hard to get measures, but then at the same time, does it matter? That is the issue really more about investment in Vancouver real estate and the kind of behaviors that occur with that investment. And I end with this map because I think we live in a remarkable urban global age, and that part of the pattern, and I remain, while I'm not sure about foreign investment in Vancouver real estate, I really do believe that, like many other cities around the world, money flows, and that money in the world is coming to Vancouver just as much as it's coming to San Francisco or Singapore or Saudi Arabia, and that how it's parking, that is where it's landing and where it ultimately parks in a city, really, I think, fundamentally provides challenges if we were to aspire for a sustainable, livable, and just city, and that where it's parking in a city perhaps means that we are posed a challenge towards rethinking some of those parking rules. So, thank you.
Thanks, Andy. And now Sandy.
Hi, and thank you, Am. Thank you, Gordon. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. And this whole issue is a really fascinating discussion, I think, that so many of us have been engaged in. And I think the fundamental answer is that we don't know. I mean, I think everybody has an opinion. They have a gut instinct. But what we're lacking are real measures. And this issue arose for me, and it arose during the civic election, over housing affordability. I don't think most people would care at all about this issue if we did not have a severe affordability crisis in our city. And so just to give a little bit of, and I don't have an opinion about, I'm agnostic about foreign buying, generally speaking. Generally speaking, it's good when foreign capital enters British Columbia. It functions like export. It's like we have a manufacturing sector and we're exporting. And in fact, in the Western economies, the developed economies, especially in North America, there's been a problem because most of the employment growth has not been happening. In fact, there's been there's been a real stalling of increased employment growth in what's called the tradable goods, which is exporting and exporting manufactured goods out. Ideally, you want to see trade and you want to see foreign capital entering. The issue around housing is that housing is functions different than other products. It functions different than lumber. It functions different from other potential exports, mining exports that we might have. Because capital is fluid, but people are not. And people need shelter. And housing is about shelter. So I just want to... This is a slide that I got from the 30s Grind, which is one of the top mummy blogger in Vancouver, Melissa Carr. On the left is a house in Los Angeles, Jason Priestley's house, that you could pick up for $2.1 million. This is in November 2012. And on the right is a Vancouver house listed. This is from this section of her blog called Are You Effing Kidding Me? So here is a look at where we stand relative to the rest of Canada. This is our average house price. We're in the this isn't really showing up here. Relative to median income, and this isn't showing. Sorry about that. Our average house price is, this is February numbers, $737,000, and this relates to, the whole slide didn't come through. I'm sorry. The slide on the far left is the Canadian average, and that's the average price of housing in Canada. What we're not seeing, the median income, is roughly $68,000. So that's the multiple. It's just under, I believe, 5 times median income. The next number, 438, that's Calgary. That's their average house price, and their median income is about $89,000. A year. Toronto is $505,000. That's their average house price, and their median income is around $68,000. And our median and our house prices are, as you can see, $736, and our median income is the lowest of these 3 cities. It's at, I believe, around $67,000 annually. Vancouver's median income is in the lowest quartile of the major metropolitan centers of Canadian cities. Our median income is comparable to Sudbury or Windsor. I believe we're below Regina. So we are not a wealthy city. We're a very working class city. But we have housing prices that are twice the average for the country. And this is a ratio of about almost 11 times median income. That median income, by the way, is 2010, but I don't think there's been very much change. So the issue is that we've got a really severe problem, and this erodes our city in a lot of ways. It erodes our business competitiveness, our ability to attract talent, our ability, I sit on boards at UBC and SFU, it erodes our ability to attract academics, it erodes our ability to attract business talent. In a lot of ways, I actually feel like one of the tests of where do we want to go, what kind of city do we want to be, in a lot of ways I feel like we want to have a mom test. How are the moms doing? How are the moms doing who are having to put winter coats on their kids to get them through the winter? The single moms, the grandmothers. Are only 5% of British Columbia senior women have an income over $40,000 a year. Where are they in this? And then there is the counter-argument that there are a lot of condos and a lot of suites, but we see them getting smaller and smaller. So the issue is, what are the families that are being served by this? When you're raising teenagers, are they going to, is this what the size they're going to have to be? Is this the family that is the ideal family for the size of suites that? Always get a dog in your slideshow, or a cat. So I got into this issue around affordability, and I got interested in the issue of foreign ownership, largely because of big changes that were happening in my neighborhood. But it made me very, very curious. And then the question arose: well, what is the cause of the affordability crisis? Because if this is happening so there's a lot of debate. It could be interest rates. The federal government has changed the CMHC eligibility rules, and that has had, I think, an enormous effect, driving down, or it's actually driven up the cost of borrowing significantly. That has helped to ease the pressure. But that's been across Canada. What's different about Vancouver? Almost everything that people point to doesn't show why it's Vancouver. And then the community has talked about, well, it's because of the ALR, and it's because of pressures, it's because of the mountains and the rivers, and the bridges, we're all packed in. But our population has not been growing. Vancouver's population has only grown since 2006 by 4.4%, not even 1% annually, between 2006 to 2011. So we're not having the population pressure, and we aren't distinguished from the other factors. Interest rates, all of these things affect the rest of the country, but they don't point to why is Vancouver so much worse. And so that has made me very curious. We don't know. This is the problem. We don't know. But we can start to look at things that are happening in other cities, because what Andy has talked about here, the empty condo situation is actually contagious. And I think that something much more interesting is going on. I think Andy has started to put his finger on it when he's talked about investment over foreign or domestic. It actually really doesn't matter. The issue of foreign investment, to me, is interesting because of the potential volume of sales. Versus, I don't think that we really particularly care, except for the potential volume and the competitiveness that can price locals out of the market. But look what we're starting to see here. This is a photo of the Plaza Hotel with lights out, and as you can see, a real estate broker estimates that only 10% of the condominiums have full-time residents. So this is starting to show up, and here is London. This is another luxury development, One Hyde Park. This is from the Vanity Fair, if you wanted to pick it up. And again, we are starting to see empty condominiums. And what I'm concerned about is that what's really starting to happen, this is really about inequality. And what this is really a story of isn't about foreign versus domestic. It's about the super wealthy moving capital and finding parking spaces for it. And I don't think we understand this very well. And I'm not going to put out a thesis. We don't have enough evidence. This is Wall Street Journal about Hong Kong. And Hong Kong has been experiencing what they call a property hoarding problem. The public policy problem is, what do we do about fulfilling demand for more housing when that demand is being when the demand that is fueling the business model is speculative investment or money parking over consumption, over homes, over shelter. The word invest, the origin of invest is to clothe. And I think we have to really be focusing our public policy on meeting the needs of the citizens who live in the city, wherever they come from, however long they've been here. Are we meeting the needs of the people who live here? And here, Hong Kong, as you can see from the bottom sentence, buying of apartments for investment now appears to easily outnumber the supply of all newly built apartments in Hong Kong. Now, what's interesting about Hong Kong is that they have 250,000 empty units in the city of Hong Kong, which amounts to approximately 1,000 30-story towers. So when we hear about ghost cities in China, actually, we're building ghost cities in our cities, and what we're not really building micro suites so much. My theory is, or what I'm putting forward as a possibility, is that we in Vancouver are participating in a global market which is affecting New York, it's affecting London, it's affecting Hong Kong, it's affecting many global cities, and the phenomenon is that we're not building micro suites. We've got a manufacturing business, and we're building really large safety deposit boxes. And so you may recognize this slide. This is from a YouTube video about the distribution of wealth and what's happening as wealth is accumulating at the very, very upper levels. And so this was an animation that was done showing if you took the distribution of wealth and you showed, and you divided it 100 people. So really, this is American population, but look at that guy at the top. And he's got to put his money somewhere. And this is happening in households around the world where people are in possession of these very, very spectacular amounts of wealth. And they are moving it. They are moving it. And one of the issues is that they're moving it into investments, but investments are not doing very well. And they're moving it, it might be in bonds, it might be in securities, it might be in many different forms of investment, but a very liquid form of investment. It's not thought of as liquid from an investor's point of view, but it actually operates that way, is in the condominium market. And look at the features of the condominium market and how different they are from the features of what I would call a healthy housing market. It used to be that you could get a remedy in the law over disputes over property called specific performance. And the remedy was based on the idea that each individual home was unique, and that what drew the buyer to that particular home was very specific to that home, and not any other could just be substituted. But what we now have developed, and I actually think that it's not just market-driven. I also think it's driven by the way that we are structuring our investments, where we have pre-sales. You could actually finance your pre-sale. So if you had equity, if you had collateral, you can actually make several 100%, possibly even 1,000% in a rising market, trading in pre-sales. These are the kinds of things that dilute risk, spread risk around, but magnify potential gains. I think that we need to look at an awful lot of our instruments, our investment instruments, to see, are they promoting the manufacturer of safe deposit boxes, or are they promoting the building of homes? And when I look at Andy's data, and we're seeing that the recent building, the classic Vancouverism, as it were, and that's where we're seeing this safety deposit box phenomenon really expressing itself. And I think we have to really ask ourselves about the whole process of building out this kind of housing, that it's not meeting the needs. It's certainly not meeting the needs of those moms who need homes for their kids that are big enough for a kid to stretch out in. I don't know if you've seen, some of these so-called bedrooms. You can hardly even fit a bed in them. This is not housing. These are investment instruments and commodities. And I'll just finish up by, we don't know what's going on as far as movement of capital across borders. We need more information. We need to understand the phenomenon of investment in housing as an investment instrument, as a commodity that is tradable between people. But I would just finish up by saying that, industry experts I do talk to industry experts, and just in the last day I had, and they do tell me about the kind of phenomenon that we're seeing with that Andy is describing, and they do talk about investors, whether they be foreign investors or domestic, but they're seeing this kind of scale. I'll just finish off with one story I spoke this morning with a senior person in a private equity company who was doing an international business trip looking for investment in commercial real estate in Vancouver. He didn't get a lot of bites because the return on commercial real estate is very low. And in other jurisdictions, the interest rates are higher. It's not so attractive. But interestingly, he was approached by an investment bank that suggested to him that, in fact, they could do a mass buy of condominiums. They weren't interested in commercial real estate, but they were interested in a purchase of between 50 and 70 condominiums that they could then resell in their country. So we know that market exists. How do we track that? How do we know it's happening? How can we best fulfill our obligations as a community to ensure that our needs, because we're not fluid, we can't fly around the world and just live where we want. We're here, our roots are here, our children are here, our future is here. And we need to take care of that and nurture the community that is here and ensure that our public policy really is all driven towards the community that will be here and the future that we all share together wherever we come from. And I would just finish up by saying that I do hope that we can start focusing in that direction. Thank you.
So first of all, I want to start out by really thanking Gordon for what? He got you? But it was all the emails from you, I thought. All right. So Am and Gordon for inviting me and including me in this event and giving me a chance to sit on a dais with such interesting and thoughtful people. So I really appreciate that opportunity. The second thing, though, is my colleagues in the economics department would be actually aghast if they knew that I was associated with them, given the low quality of my academic research, and therefore I need to point out that I'm at the Sauder School of Business, not the Department of Economics, thus allowing them to breathe easy and keep their heads high with their international reputation. Now, the other thing is this is going to be the first time in years that I've given a presentation without PowerPoint, and so I'm using this old technology, which is paper and pen, which will be a very interesting experience, and thus save you guys from seeing me click through multiple times. So I'll give it a try, and mainly because I ended up being stuck in situations without a Wi-Fi access, kind of like this room, and thus not being able to download all kinds of interesting pictures to populate otherwise boring bits of words on a slide. So I think what I want to start in talking about is at some point the whole notion of foreign investment is really not what we should be talking about. Our discussion here doesn't need to be, it's certainly not about foreign. That's not really a necessary part of the discussion, nor is investment necessarily the right word to be using. And the reason I want to start out with that is the city of Vancouver has a great deal of interest and enthusiasm in rental housing and preserving rental housing and ensuring rental housing and creating rental housing. Well, it turns out the people who do that have another name. They're called investors. So therefore, when we're talking about investors, that term includes all the people who supply rental housing. And whether they're, a citizen of Hong Kong, London, Toronto, Calgary, Burnaby, or the city of Vancouver, it really doesn't matter for the availability of a unit that somebody is occupying. Right? And so I think it's really important to some extent that we sort of put aside the whole discussion about foreign investors and not necessarily use those words. Our issue here is really with unoccupied units. Right? Our concern, if we're thinking about housing affordability, is really with units that have been built, have been purchased. Right? So there's demand for those units, but they're not occupied because in some sense they're occupying land, which is our scarce resource, but they're not addressing occupancy issues for people who want to live here. Now, it turns out that in and of itself wouldn't necessarily be a big problem if we didn't have supply restrictions. So if you don't constrain the supply of housing, then the fact that there's some people who want to own units and keep them vacant is not nearly as much an issue as if you're in an environment where it becomes more difficult to create new space. And so I think it's going to be the interaction of those two pieces, that there is demand to have units be vacant and the ability to supply units is rather constrained in this environment, both because of geographic issues, which I blame on God, so there's a spiritual element to this, but also a very non-spiritual political element to it as well. So when we're thinking about who are these evil people who are using up space and land but not living in it, they are a very diverse set of people. They include business people in Toronto who come out here periodically and thus own a place here, or their company owns a place, rather than necessarily renting a hotel. It is someone from Langley who lives out in the suburbs but likes to come into the city and have a good time, and it would rather do that by owning a unit that they use periodically rather than renting hotel space. It includes people who are getting capital out of Venezuela and are looking for a place to park capital that's not necessarily covered in banking regulations. One of the advantages of real estate as a place to park capital is it doesn't get covered in banking regulations, and thus it's a lot more difficult for international regulatory institutions to seize it or to address it. It also includes, investors from Burnaby who are buying units and they prefer to maximize their liquidity by having it be vacant. So when they want to sell it, they can sell it more quickly, both to another investor or to a potential owner-occupier. Right. So if you're looking for holding something for sale as opposed to cash flow, it's a lot better to have it vacant because a potential owner-occupier doesn't have to deal with kicking the tenant out when they want to move in. So we got a variety of different people. Obviously, the question here is how much, and I think Andy has done a really good job. In fact, the only so whether or not it's good or not, it's the only job, right? So so there's the ultimate job in trying to figure this out in terms of how many units are actually vacant, and obviously some of those are going to be investor owned. I've done a little bit of work that's addressed this. Well, not even work. That's too strong a word. I've done a little bit of matching census numbers with housing starts and completion numbers. So I've done a little bit of subtraction work. Actually, it's division. I've done division work. Looking at over the last census decade, so 2001 to 2006, 2006 to 2011, and then extrapolating that 2011 to 2012, looking at the growth in households versus the completions in terms of housing completions. And we've consistently been in the range of about 15% sort of more units than growth in households. Right now, however, right, that does not mean that that's all vacant units. Right, there's a whole bunch of boring, uninteresting data reasons why that would be a gross overcount. It's also useful to note that the city in Canada that had about 40% more housing completions between 2006 and 2012, housing completions than household growth is Winnipeg. So there's a lot of, when you start looking at these things across jurisdictions, a lot of other interesting things happen. In terms of Andy brought up some of the data that I had worked on that looks at the sort of estimate, and it's really an underestimate of investor owned, because a lot of people who might own a unit and not occupy it still have the assessment ticket sent to the unit. Right, and so that's why you're going to get the 61-51. One part of that is going to be that undercount. But again, it is a downtown phenomenon, right? Downtown, and I define it a little bit differently, and look at a slightly different set of mix of units, is about 65% in 2009 potentially investor owned, compared to 25% for the rest of the city. So this is very much that, and it's, as you can see from Andy's data, strikingly higher in Cole Harbour than it is anywhere else, because a lot of this sort of empty discussion is really a luxury unit discussion, right? It's not, it's not smaller units. If you're looking to get 20 million out of Nigeria, it's a whole lot easier to buy one $20 million penthouse than buy, however, I can't divide up what I'm setting up here, however many large number of small condos in Surrey. Right? It's like, I'll buy that town. So it's a lot easier to do that way. So there is very much a luxury focus here, rather than, and to the extent you think there's a geographic or product segmentation here, it may be actually quite divorced from the set of affordability issues that we think about when it comes to younger households or potential first-time buyers. I think the other thing that we need to flag, because we don't like to talk about it, is this seems to be this decade or this last 2 years version of the yellow peril. The reality is we keep using foreign investment, which is sort of our new buzzword for Chinese investment. And I find it, obviously there's a long history on the west coast of North America about worrying about some problem, whether it's low wages, venereal disease, the plague, whatever you want, and blaming it on the Chinese. On the East Coast, it tends to be other things. But I find it particularly striking that the sort of emergence of concern about foreign investment started in about 2010, when all of a sudden the good people on the west side of Vancouver discovered that they could sell their houses for like $3 million to people who spoke Mandarin, right? Pocketed the money, and then were aghast that their kids couldn't move in. Right? Well, they could have given the house to the kids in the first place, right? But that didn't happen. So there is a little bit of this that feels really manufactured very recently. Now, having said that, the whole notion of foreign investment in real estate is a much older issue. And I will just point out that in the 1980s in the United States, the late 1980s, the concern was that Japan was going to buy up the United States. Right, that the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was worth more than the whole state of California. The Japanese bought Pebble Beach, they bought Rockefeller Center, but they did not take it to Tokyo. Right, one of the things about real estate, it is rather immobile, and so what they ended up doing was selling it later on back to somebody else. This issue of foreign investment also shows up. Toronto people are concerned about it. They're more concerned about sort of overbuilding issues, but their mix of foreign investors tends to be Iranians, the Russian mafia, South Americans, and Nigerians. So everyone has their different set of mixes. So if what it is that we're concerned about are empty units, and I think that is a very reasonable concern to have, because in the sort of environment that we have, even if it is all luxury units, it's still going to have upward pressure on housing markets, and affordability is clearly an issue. I mean, obviously, the first thing to do is try to measure it. Right, and as Andy has done an excellent job of trying to address that, but there are real challenges. But it would really be nice to actually measure that. Now that would involve sort of dealing with privacy issues and all kinds of things political. But that would really be a good place to start. I think the second place to start would be dealing with the reality that foreign investment would not be an issue if we didn't have supply constraints. And our supply constraints, which are usually thanks to local governments, who are acting in the interests or following the preferences of residents. Residents basically don't want change, right? Or they want change, they want it somewhere else. That's a bigger problem. I mean, I live in the city of Vancouver, and I see all these. Affordable is a strong word, but let's say less less unaffordable. There we go. Less unaffordable, older single-family houses, right, being torn down and replaced by gigantic houses that completely fill up the lot, right, which cost a whole lot more. Now, you might ask, why did they do that? Well, because you cannot take that lot, subdivide it into 2 lots, and build 2,000 square foot houses. Right? We've got zoning that essentially really mitigates against the ability to maximize the number of, say, family-oriented units that we want to create. There are a lot of reasons for that. Well, it's going to be parking, it's going to be congested, we're going to have, all sorts of things like this. But fundamentally, if what we really wanted to deal with affordability is, we'd say, gee, our cities have to change, and they can't be sort of this nice, luxurious, single-family carpet with sort of 1 unit every 5,000 square feet of land space. We'd have to do something different. I was asked, what would I do if I was in charge to deal with affordability, and I said I would do that, but I would also be needing not only the Vancouver Police Department, but the Canadian Armed Forces to defend me from the rage of the residents of Dunbar as they came to lynch me for turning their land to single-family houses on 5,000 square foot lots to single-family houses on smaller lots. So I'm going to end here with a big cheer for investors, because if you don't have investors, you don't have rental housing. And I think that that's something that needs to be recognized as a starting point, and that's going to be my ending point. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tsur. Now we have about 15 or 20 minutes that we're going to keep it here in the panel before we open it up to the floor. And I'm going to start off with this because I've just finished an article that in fact will be in the April issue of Vancouver magazine that throws another couple of wrenches into this discussion. And the first, I guess, deals with, I've written a lot about this subject, and I've never really considered foreign investment to be a very particularly important issue as far as Vancouver housing. From everything I've read and I've talked to a lot of developers, a lot of marketers, all that kind of stuff. It exists, but as the various statistics that people like Andy come up with, it's relatively small. But about 3 years ago, I wrote an article for the Globe and Mail magazine, which I believe was probably one of the first ones to sort of deal with the really major influx of mainland Chinese into Vancouver, and one of its effects being on real estate. And in the course of that, I came upon a book that had just been published by David Lay, the UBC geographer. And one of the things he did was he looked at his data was from the 1980s and 1990s. But he took Vancouver housing prices and checked them against a whole bunch of variables: population growth, GDP, all the normal things, interprovincial migration. And he found that in general, the associations were not particularly strong. But one association was very strong, and that association was immigration. When immigration to BC went up, and most of immigration to BC is to Vancouver, Vancouver housing prices went up, and sales volume. And I got nothing against immigration. In fact, I think it's absolutely necessary. I'm just think that if we're trying to understand why housing prices are high in Vancouver, and we find that there's a very strong association between housing prices and one particular data point, then we should look into that. As I said, Lay's data ends in the 1990s, so it's not particularly useful now. So in the course of researching this article for Vancouver magazine, I took just a quick look, didn't do any math, I just looked at some very quick associations. I think if you could do the same, you could look at the course of our latest real estate boom. And if you do that, you'll find that sales and prices went up very, very rapidly between 2005 and 2007. Naturally, they dipped during the nasty little recession. But then they bounced back very strongly, or at least they had the appearance of bouncing back very strongly. If you then look at immigration numbers, you'll find that between 2005 and 2007, they were extremely high, around almost 60,000 a year, which is very, very high. The average is more in the 40,000 range into BC. Then they dipped during the recession because people weren't moving. Then they bounced back a little after the recession, but not particularly, not a whole lot. But the one thing that did bounce back very strongly in between 2009 and 2010 especially, was the number of investor immigrants. It's hard for us to actually get a precise figure on this because one of the things that happens with that program is that investor immigrants can qualify in different provinces. That doesn't mean they have to live there. And in fact, we know that Quebec, which has its own immigration system, lets in around 4,000 investor immigrants a year, and very few of them move to Quebec. Most of them actually move to Vancouver. But we can estimate that number at somewhere in the 8,000 to 10,000 range during that period. If we look at the boom that took place in Vancouver real estate after the Depression, it really wasn't a boom. In fact, if you look at the MLS on their site and look at their benchmark index for various housing types in Vancouver, you'll find that most of them are cheaper now than they were 5 years ago. Our numbers are just skewed because we had a huge boom in Richmond and Vancouver in single-family housing. A little bit of a knock-on effect. People who wanted to buy in those areas and couldn't afford it or whatever, and they ended up buying a house in Burnaby or North Van or an apartment somewhere else. This is merely a correlation. Correlation is not causation, but I think if you connect these dots, you can see that there is a very strong effect of Vancouver property reacting to immigration numbers. So you might ask, well, why would immigrants be buying a house in this incredibly overpriced place? I mean, immigrants aren't stupid. In fact, we know that just by the nature of our immigration system, we in fact managed to get a very, very high class of immigrant, much higher than anywhere else in Canada, in fact. We don't get refugees. We tend to get a really high end of immigrant. Those people should be smarter, right? Well, one thing that really needs to be looked at a little bit is, I think the media has been really complicit in this. The affordability issue, I'm not saying it's not an issue, but we keep buying this stats that come from this a company in demographic called Demographica, which is one guy in St. Louis, Missouri, who's an avowed right-wing commentator who is out to prove that any attempt to reduce car usage will result in a lower quality of life and more expensive housing. His survey, which shows Vancouver to be the second highest, most expensive, least affordable place in the world, includes only 7 countries, 7% of the world's population. If you look at Numbeo, which is the largest survey it uses almost exactly the same, comes up with almost exactly the same numbers as Demographica, but it includes 362 cities around the world. Vancouver is in fact the 125th least affordable city on a price-to-income basis. It's more affordable than almost every city in Asia. If you took out the almost 100 North American cities on Numbeo, Vancouver would actually be in the top half of affordable cities in the world on a price-to-income basis. And we're kind of in a sweet spot, to tell you the truth, at 10.74, with a lot of the other cities, the sort of secondary global cities, and I'm going to just run a few, the Copenhagens, the Stockholms, the Sydneys, the Melbournes, they're all in the same range as us. And the cities that you think of as, let's call them the potboiler cities where you set your novel, they're typically the Londons and the Parises and so on. They're half to double our price-to-income ratio. Would it be nice if we could improve our affordability? Well, in the next little while, we're going to, because our prices are going to drop, because that right now, that's just inevitable. But more than likely, as Tsur says, the solutions are going to have to do with rezoning to get rid of some of these vast areas of single-family housing that can't be afforded, having better, smarter types of condominiums. So we emphasize better design so that we can live in smaller places more efficiently. It's unlikely that we're going to depart from this basically, the fat part of the global livability graph. That's the point I attempted to make in this in the Vancouver Magazine article. At any rate, and with that, I'm going to throw open this discussion to other members of the panelists. I bet that Sandy might mount something of a defense against what I just said.
Well, yeah, because I've done the numbers. I didn't look at demographic. I did the numbers on New York and on London, and you're wrong. We are less affordable than New York City.
Yes. We are the least affordable in North America.
In North America. So in the category that we occupy, North American cities, we are the least affordable, and we don't have a strong economic foundation. We have a big manufacturing sector. We manufacture condominiums, and that's our big industry. I do want to talk a little bit about the yellow peril argument, because I don't think that this is very helpful, really. It's not like people made this up out of thin air. I mean, this was reported in the Wall Street Journal. It was reported in the New York Times, the effect of buying coming out of Asia, capital flowing out of Asia. It was reported in the Globe and Mail. It was reported in the South China Morning Post, the effect of capital flowing out of Asia and the cities that it's been affecting, and Vancouver included. Mark Carney, the head of the Bank of Canada, has talked about it, and as have most of the senior economists of the major Canadian banks. So I don't think this is something that people in Dunbar thought up as a way to blame, to point fingers at anybody. We've had a long experience of relationships throughout with our communities, and I don't think it's helpful. Certainly not, and not only has it been reported in these media outlets, but all the realtors, until it started to become a problem, all the realtors were singing the praises of this huge amount of money pouring out of Asia. So suddenly everybody's to blame and everybody's a racist because they believed what the media and the head of the Bank of Canada and the realtors told them. I don't think that's particularly fair. I think the big issue is we need to track this, and I do think we need to look at the effect of capital flow, regardless of where it comes from, but the effect of capital flow on housing. And, Andy, so there has been discussion of the luxury market, and I think there's a good point there. But Andy, according to your numbers of the downtown core, we've got the equivalent of 23 30-story towers sitting empty in our downtown core. Is that not correct?
I think it's an interesting way of kind of gelling those numbers, because one of the aspects of that data set is that we don't know why they're empty, but it frames up
23 30-story towers, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's empty on one day.
It comes to be on one day. But I think what's interesting is, I think when we talk,
the census is one day.
Yeah, it's one day. But I think it's one way of kind of framing a discussion in a discussion of what are we building for? What kind of city are we building? And I think it's interesting, because I actually going to talking about Tsur's point about investment, and that I think one thing that I need to add is that within that investment pool there is actually a good amount that if anything subsidized our rental, our lack of building purpose-built rental for like the last 20 years, and that I think I actually have to recognize that point that I didn't mention in my presentation, that we actually get a really nice rental pool. Mind you, it's not necessarily affordable out of this particular type of investment. Not affordable, but I think it's not only not affordable, unsecure. And I think that part of this issue about perhaps and this is, I think, a fairly interesting and important discussion, is actually security of tenure. That as we tell 20-somethings and 30-somethings that the rest of your life will be renting, well, are you willing to provide a certain security of tenure for those units that can I rent for life? Can I have the ability
and I can tell you the moms don't want to be raising kids and being told they've got to get up and move at the end of the month or in a few weeks. This is no way to build a community. You know, we don't have that tradition here. It may work in some cities, but we don't have a tradition. This is a huge change for families.
It's a very interesting notion of a city, though, that everyone should be able to be in one unit and sort of be there forever. I mean, when you look at history of cities are dynamic places. Sure. Neighborhoods change as people move in and out. And people, have the home ownership rate of people 25 to 35 in Canada is very low. The lifetime home ownership is extremely high. And I think that if you say, the lifetime home ownership in the West End, if someone who always stays in the West End, is probably pretty low. But people do move and go elsewhere. And I think the notion that you sit in one neighborhood and that's where you live for the rest of your life is certainly counter the historic evidence on the way cities happen to be. I think cities are dynamic places. That's what makes them interesting and fun.
But that kind of movement also is very, very hard on vulnerable populations. I've met women in the West End who are in their 70s, 80s, who had worked for 30, 40 years and built up savings. And now they are eating into their savings just to hang on there. You can't tell these people, move to New Westminster after they've lived 50 years in the West End, and now they are, I've talked to some of these ladies. They are eroding their savings to the point that they will be out. They know they'll be done in 2 or 3 years. And you look in their eyes and you ask them, well, what will you do then? And you can just see the cold knife of fear in their eyes. And we are letting these people down. We have an obligation here. And I don't think it's good enough to say, well, we just have to get used to these are historical averages. We have to care about these people, and we have to have some policy responses to it.
But you know what? That would be a problem here if there wasn't $1 of foreign investment. That's an issue that Vancouver has to deal with. That has to do with, growing income inequalities in North America for a whole variety of reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with the housing market per se. If you want to talk about affordability, we had greater affordability problems in the 1990s than we do now. Affordability, sort of properly measured on a payment-to-income ratio for home buyers, has actually declined since 2008 with the decline in interest rates. And compared to the rest of Canada, as far back as decent data goes, which is the mid-1970s, we've been dramatically less affordable. I mean, that is a constancy here. I think that we want to talk about the poor and the vulnerable. That's not a market issue. The market is never going to address the issue of that population. That has to be addressed through the actions of government out of choices. So I think it is an important issue. I'm not quite sure how we deal with it in the context of thinking about investment.
Well, the way that I think that it affects that foreign investment plays a role is in investor confidence. I think whether or not, and this is one of the more interesting things about this debate, because I think that the media has, as we've started to get into this and start to peel back the layers, there's been a question, well, how much is there? Actually, from my perspective, my experience as an investor, it almost doesn't matter, because there is the public perception that there is an endless stream of potential buyers from offshore who are going to come in and buy whatever. So number one, if you can possibly get into the market, you can't lose, because your property will go up, and God damn it, you'd better get in there, or else your property values are going to go up, is going to reach away from you. That's all about investor confidence, and public perception plays a huge role. So I actually think this is one reason why it's absolutely critical for us to start pulling this apart, collecting better data. The Land Title Office we should be asking our political leaders to be collecting this data so that we can start tracking it and really understand it. Because if it's not happening, if for some reason or other, if the public got the idea tomorrow that there's no buying coming from outside, that it's not a factor, I think most investors would think, oh, you mean the merry-go-round might stop. And I think, in fact, that has happened.
I have a question for the panel. It is entirely possible, for British Columbia at least, I doubt that Vancouver could individually, to have restrictions on foreign ownership of land in the province. Saskatchewan already does that for farmland. Prince Edward Island does that for farmland. Australia has foreign ownership restrictions. Is that something we should be considering? What would the effect of that be?
Until we know.
Just we have no data.
Well, I guess the question is, what are you trying to do by restricting foreign ownership? What's the actual policy outcome you want to accomplish by, and we've identified how problematic foreign ownership is. What is the outcome that you're trying to do with those types of policies? And it sounds like, generally speaking, from the panel and from the audience, it's the issue of affordable housing. How do people set roots in the city? Can they set roots in the city? Do people who grow up in the city should they be allowed to set roots in the city? Or ultimately, is the solution a airplane ticket to Toronto, Calgary, or California? I take the one for California, by the way. But that I think that's really an interesting notion. Is there a notion of rootedness in the city? What's the societal moral sentiment towards setting roots in Vancouver, or do we not? I think this is actually just philosophical, and I'll take this out of the ways. I've been trying to because they've somehow made me an adjunct professor at SCARP, which is a bit of a miracle, but that really, I think, philosophically, in the notion of planning, is urban planning kind of the gardener? Are we there to help nurture various groups in the city so that they can grow and set root in the city? Or are planners the kind of stadium builders that we are there to set up the arena, and that ultimately the arena will describe the kind of battle of groups, will ultimately put forth a winner? And I think that's a struggle towards the field of urban planning. That is it just setting up this arena, and the wisdom to figure out what those interventions are, because I actually very much believe that planning and the field of the area of urban planning is about gardening, is about nurturing those in the city who face adversity. And I think that's probably part of the challenges and what those interventions might look like. And is how much would say something, and so backing up, would say banning foreign ownership really fix it, as opposed to other aspects towards, say, growing income, that somehow nurturing a vibrant economic base, whatever that may be, and pursuing that type of nurturing aspect of economics, because I think that there's also a demand side of incomes, that's perhaps one of the other types of policy avenues we need to pursue.
Oh, and one of the other aspects about restricting foreign ownership is I don't think that we need to. That's a pretty blunt instrument. Other cities are introducing things like stamp taxes. So Hong Kong has a stamp tax on foreign ownership. Singapore allows unlimited buying in certain parts of the city, and then other parts of the city there's no foreign buying allowed. I think that one of the things that, to the extent that I think that we do need to look at our tax structure, I think that it's if people are parking capital here, strictly parking capital, I think that should be taxed in a completely different way, and the benefits of that tax should be being spread across the rest of our housing needs for our city. So I think there are lots of instruments to look at. This just underscores how important it is for us to get better facts.
I'm going to make some comments about sort of the cynicism of policies that are implemented. So Australia has probably the uniquely cynical way of allowing foreign investment in new buildings, thus not harming developers, but forbidding it in existing neighborhoods, thus not ruffling the feathers of existing residents, which has a certain level of cynicism to it, while it may still be a good policy. So I think introducing policies without knowing what's actually going on is probably not a good idea, although I'm not always sure that stopped some politicians from pursuing, and I won't make a blanket statement about that. I think the thing that Jim brings up about immigration is actually phenomenally important. Now, I actually have different numbers than he has in terms of sort of stability of immigration versus its variation. But where he's bang on is how different our mix of immigrants is compared to the rest of Canada, not just in where they come from, but really if you sort of compare sort of investor entrepreneurs versus family reunification refugees, compared to the rest of Canada, we're all about entrepreneurs and investors. I think that becomes interesting, though, with the changes that are occurring at the federal level in immigration policy, which is moving away from sort of people with capital and towards people with skills. And you might think that those people would actually then move to where there are jobs and opportunity, which is not BC. It's places like Alberta, dare I say it, Toronto, and places in between. And I think that is potentially a more interesting dynamic going forward than some of the other ones that we've addressed.
Well, and in fact, it's already happening because, in fact, the investor immigrant program, the last 2 years numbers have dropped dramatically for various reasons. And what do you know? The price of houses on the west side and in Richmond is down between 10 and 15%. And maybe that's just
be careful. The last time a Canadian team won the Stanley Cup, housing prices were a whole lot lower too. So you got to be a little careful there.
Okay, we're down to 15 or 20 minutes to go, so I think it's time to open it up to some questions. I see one from Gordon Price in the front row there, but it's hard for me to see to the back. And we have some mics that, so if you put up your hand, we'll try to acknowledge you. And if I could ask everyone to keep their questions relatively short, because I think we'll probably have a few. Up in the back corner, do we have a mic on?
I got a built-in one.
Okay, we're good.
You haven't commented really at all on interest rates and on what is going to happen to affordability and what might happen to international investment when interest rates go up.
Which one of us do you want to comment on that?
I think you.
All right. Well, so one of the reasons why, so if your measure of affordability, and it's just one measure of affordability, is sort of a payment for real estate to income ratio. And then, it obviously depends on what type of real estate and these kinds of things. If you use that, because of the decline in interest rates, certainly over the last decade plus, but even since 2008, payment to income ratios have fallen in Vancouver. Not a lot, but they've fallen since 2008. If I could tell you for certain what would happen to interest rates in the next N years, I would be making so much more money trading on international exchanges. And I think anyone who tells you where interest rates are going to go, all they're basically saying is, gee, they were higher in the past, they'll be higher in the future. If you look at the yield curves, which essentially are documenting the sort of what traders in the market think is going to happen, yield curves right now are really, really flat, which suggests that markets are not real sure that we're looking at significant interest rate changes anytime in the near future. Interest rates going up have this sort of mixed effect of increasing payments and lowering house prices, right? So it's kind of depends on how these things play out. I think as well for the people that we should be most concerned about, right? I'm not concerned about the people who, instead of buying a condo at 20, buying their first house at 25, buy it at 35. I don't think that's the big issue. I think the issue for affordability is really the vulnerable and the poor. The issues for them are remarkably disconnected from interest rates and much more connected to what we choose to do through government policy and other kinds of tools to address their needs.
It's interesting that Jim Flaherty indicated that he had moved quite strongly. Was it Manulife that was introducing the very attractive 5-year rate, I think under 3%, 2.89, and Flaherty moved very quickly on that. I think that interest rates are a really key issue. Nobody knows what they will do, but there's a kind of folly in assuming that they will remain low indefinitely into the future. And this also is a huge form of risk for those who are on the hook. But it may portend lower prices. I mean, if those interest rates start heading significantly higher, I just don't see these numbers sustainable. I'm interested to see. My own guess is that Mark Carney has been working behind the scenes on this. I think that his big concern is that the concept behind keeping interest rates low was for business confidence, for business investment, and to keep the economy get the economy going, or keep it firing on all cylinders. And he feels that it's vulnerable. The problem is, and as he's commented on it himself, is that what people did with the low interest rates, instead of doing more business investment, they just went out and bought houses and bought condos, and there's been a hoarding of capital. So it's a difficult issue, but I think that this is the sort of Damocles that's hanging over a lot of the more recent buyers, I think.
Jim, I think I'm working. I just wanted to tell people, actually, use the mic. We are recording this, but now that I got it, were the numbers that you were showing for the city of Vancouver, metro, or both, and how could we tell?
They were for the city of Vancouver, but I also have them for Metro Vancouver, and I also have them for multiple metropolitan areas for Vancouver and the United States.
But it's fair to say, for the presentation that we saw, we were only talking about the city of Vancouver.
Yeah. Yeah, with Surrey tossed in there just in one of the numbers, and I think it is actually interesting to see the kind of geographic diversities that that you see within the data set.
Then I do have a follow-up question. Mm-hmm. Why? Why is this issue only being discussed as if Boundary Road made a difference?
Why? Curious. Why indeed?
Well, the numbers that I have are the CREA numbers, and I believe they are for the metro area. But I can't be certain of that. But I think that until we solve our transit problem, I think it is a live issue about the concentration in Vancouver, and the reason is that, again, it's about drawing talent and being we're in a global competition for great talent. People want to live close to where they're working. We've got a university at UBC. I think that how many people are employed there? Drawing talent is a huge engine for the economy, and if people can't get to their work, they'll just move somewhere else. I mean, this is happening to so many young people. We're losing people all the time. And that's another part of this, is the drain of talent that we already have. People moving to other cities.
But towards why, I think it's an interesting kind of regional perspective, because it talks about, well, how do we look as a regional city, and what are some of those investments, and how perhaps the world views Vancouver, and perhaps the kind of fundamental regional changes that might occur. That I think that this is, to a certain extent, it's because I live in Vancouver. I'm fairly vested in Vancouver. I kind of like the place. That's why I focused on Vancouver. But certainly, perhaps a second panel we can look at regional issues there.
So I think that if you go past Boundary Road, all of a sudden, particularly if you cross the Fraser River, you start looking at a very different picture. And that affordability issues in the valley are very different than affordability issues in the city of Vancouver. That when you compare us to other metropolitan areas, particularly in the United States, sort of the difference between the central city, in this case Vancouver, and the suburbs, is markedly a different pattern for us than it is for most other places other than sort of like San Francisco or these other very high amenity cities. The other thing, I know this is going to come as a shock, but it turns out most people work in the suburbs. The standard home to work commute, even in the city, even in the Lower Mainland, is a suburb to suburb commute. So I know that the greatest concentration of employment is downtown, but most activity in the city actually takes place not in the city of Vancouver in terms of employment. That's where most people live, and that's where they hold their lives. And it's a very, very different, I don't want to say it's a different place. Obviously it's a different place, but I think that a lot of the issues that we have and we talk about are very different there. Certainly, there are not a lot of uber wealthy sort of parking their capital in Port Moody right now.
And I think it is worth noting that again that over the last 5 years, the only place that has seen high price rises is the city of Vancouver and Richmond and Burnaby a little bit. But as soon as you go out to the valley or the eastern suburbs or Sunshine Coast, anywhere like that, prices are down, even or down as much as 10 to 20% over the last 5 years. Okay. Any more questions?
Yeah.
Right there.
First, I want to thank Andy for the data, Tsur, for being willing to say that there's some truth to the racism argument, and Sandy for using medians as house prices and not the more distorting averages, which would boost those house prices substantially. But I have a question about your use of house prices, comparing them to median incomes, because you're picking the house prices just the way that the banks do and the way that people think about house prices. That's the cost of the house. And the real cost of the house, if you can't afford the house in Vancouver, is to get in your car and start driving out towards Abbotsford or maybe Hope, where you will find cheaper house prices. But the real cost is the cost of the house. The cost of housing is the cost of a house plus the cost of transportation. So when we talk about Calgary being so much cheaper than Vancouver, let's add 20% for extra for the cost of transportation in Calgary. And Tsur, if you really want to divide single-family housing lots in Vancouver, we've already done that. By right, Vancouver is the only city in North America where by right you can have a secondary unit and a lane house.
No, come on. There's a big difference between sort of taking a condominium building and laying it on its side down an alley and actually creating, freehold subdivision kinds of patterns. There's a real big difference between those two, Michael.
But it's density, sir.
Density is good, but the laneway stuff is not that much different than building up. I'm sort of thinking of, and it's 1 and 2 bedrooms, right? We keep hearing about families, so I was sort of presenting it in the context of how do we create more family housing. So those 1-bedroom laneway houses, little dicey with 2 kids and a dog.
But I think this Tsur, you really touched upon, I think, a really interesting point is that as we move out of downtown in development, that perhaps what we need to worry about isn't just units, but the type of units. Yeah. And particularly where they're landing. That we just did $1 million, our third annual $1 million line for single family homes, and part of our interest is the fact that so much of Vancouver. I know there's a whole economics versus planning kind of thing where they sometimes don't get along, but then part of it is that the element that 80% of the public school infrastructure is actually out in the formerly single-family home districts. But I think a certain level of vigilance to that, perhaps we're shifting from single-family homes, but I would stand really hard on saying that it should be about families in those particular neighborhoods and how that density can be used to nurture those families, that I think is the challenge. Because, for 20 years, we've been very successful at building a particular form of development. And I think the interesting stat is that in those 20 years, 80 to 85% of all development in the city of Vancouver landed in two places, downtown Vancouver and Joyce Station. And I think that the rest of it was kind of evenly distributed for any number of political reasons throughout the city in little quiet realms. And I think what's interesting is as development now, a big development moves out of downtown Vancouver, the kind of challenges that are moving forward. But I think, part of this is not just taking unit counts, but I think looking at the quality of those units and what what they're supposed to do for these communities, that I think is an important criteria to consider for development, particularly outside the downtown core, simply because of the amount of family infrastructure that's been invested there for well over 80 years.
Yes.
Cool.
Right there.
I agree.
Well, this isn't a question, but I have a comment.
Okay.
Over here. Right here, yeah. Oh. Well, I have a comment. I think the topic that we're discussing here is a bit misguided. I don't think we should talk about affordability. We should be talking more about increasing incomes and creating jobs. Because if we don't really talk about this if we have median incomes of $120,000, these homes will be affordable. We don't have affordable questions in Aspen, Colorado, or Whistler, BC, because this is a nice place. People want to come here. We don't want to live in Edmonton or Regina, but we want to live here because it's a nice place. And if we're opening up this place to people, we should really make this a truly nice city, the #1 city in the world to live in. I think all of us have heard about this recent news. People in the downtown east side were protesting against the restaurant Pigeon. They're protesting against gentrification. I think the topic of affordability is a similar protest, but on a different level. I think we should really think about where this city should be headed. Instead of creating taxes, as you mentioned, we should be making this place more attractive to companies, more attractive to immigrants, and more attractive to everyone. And yes, that will increase prices, but at the same time will increase our economy and make this place a much better place for everyone. So that's my comment.
Okay, thank you. We have time for 3 more questions.
So, my question here is, since you already talked about the Foreign Investment Board in Australia, and I'm a big proponent and always wondered why we didn't have something similar here. So since you are, look at it, was there actually any evidence, or is there any evidence showing that had actually made a difference in affordability over there, or is just just another board that they have?
Sir, do you have
Australian house prices look a whole lot like ours. If you were going to sort of pick a country in the world to match with Canadian house prices in general, and in particular sort of like Vancouver type house prices, Australia and then sort of Sydney or Melbourne, they match up really, really nicely. So I just see it as I perceive their particular policy as somewhat of a sort of cynical political maneuver that doesn't really do much to address. I mean, it may address sort of who buys in what neighborhood.
But they did have relief of affordability. They did start to see some subsiding.
Well, it doesn't. If there's an easing of affordability, it's not because of their prices, because their prices, they look like ours.
No, basically, you can't just say one day that we don't want foreign investors. Of course, any country, you want foreign investment to come in, but you want it to be diversified in other regions. So the region or the greater area collectively grows instead of you just, like you said, party within a single area.
Or a single asset class. I mean, that's really, and this gets to, in this gets...
For me, I'm not an economist, but the way I see it is investing in homes is just a net investment. It's not creating, apart from maybe a couple of people, it's not creating real economy or real economic capital.
It's like empty calories. And this gets to the point of, yes, we do want foreign investment. We want it across all our sectors. And if there are mechanisms by which we can, first of all, we don't know the amount because we're not measuring it, so we need to measure it. But secondly, to the extent that it is coming in, if it is pooling, And there is some suggestion. I mean, the very fact that I was speaking to a private equity guy who was dealing with, and they were looking at the numbers and they were trying to figure out if they could do a deal. They ended up not doing a deal for 50 condos, but they were seriously looking at it. The fact that that market may exist but wouldn't it be so much better to have that capital coming in and going into business investment that could employ people? I do think
we call those the oil sands, but that's a different issue.
Well, the oil sands are not in Vancouver. But I think actually that our housing prices are a barrier to our economic development, because I think a lot of companies, I mean, unless you look at the kind of companies that are coming here, look at the Pixar, we're talking about Facebook, look at the profile. We're not talking, those are young guys. Yeah, they're great for the shoebox apartments, but what about those businesses that are going to need families to arrive here?
Okay,
they can't move here.
Right over there.
I've got a question right here. So if you want to compare Vancouver on the international stage, and Tsur, you're comparing to Sydney.
Well, Melbourne, I don't know. No. Sydney is Toronto with like good gifts from God.
And how the house is brokered. If I'm not mistaken, Sydney's more an auction market.
It's an auction market, yeah. Australia is an auction market.
As an auction market, it's
yeah.
reflecting more than market value, whereas Vancouver is a superficially inflated market value because the Post is building it, Rennie's marketing it, and the agents are selling it at $888,000. Aren't we comparing apples and oranges?
I think you'd be really hard pressed to find some evidence that suggested that the sales mechanism, whether it's sort of a broker search mechanism or an auction mechanism, leads to noticeable differences in house prices. Certainly in Scotland, where they have both mechanisms, you don't really see a lot of difference in the two prices between the two. But I wanted to go back, to the income story. I think, a lot of the issues that we have are income side issues, right? I mean, the housing side issues really are more about sort of supply issues. But if you're expecting the development community to create sort of affordable housing for low income people on a market basis, that doesn't work, and that's never worked anywhere. The new housing has never been the housing for the poor, and so therefore, if you're concerned about the poor and the vulnerable, that's an income side issue. If you're concerned about how affordability problems have worsened, to a great extent, that's an increase in income inequality that is very much a developed economy issue. It's not just Vancouver, and it's not just Canada. And then if you're worried about sort of why our income's so low, that has a lot to do with, among other things, with sort of investment climate and the climate for starting businesses and growing businesses, which are in some sense a different issue than what we're probably trying to talk about here, but still extremely important.
One more question right there.
Thank you. Thank you all for presenting. Really appreciate it. Jim, this question is for you. You mentioned in your magazine, you made the claim that prices will inevitably fall. I've been hearing that a lot for over the past couple of years. Just wondering, sort of, in all your opinion on a crash, the possibility of it, the inevitability of it, and where that sort of stems from, and how that leads to what could happen from it.
All I said is that we could very accurately predict the next 2 to 4 months of price movements through months of inventory, which has proven to be an incredibly accurate foreteller of price movements. And right now, there's approximately close to 8 months of inventory, i.e. there's 8 times as many listings as sell in a particular month. As soon as a month of inventory gets much over 7, prices begin to drop, and it's virtually foolproof. Well, you can only predict 1, 2, 3 months ahead using months of inventory, and it could change at any moment.
I think we could be in for a significant correction. I think there are indications there, and the drop in volumes. That's got to have an effect.
I think the only thing that's inevitable is I'm going to eat dinner after we finish here, because I haven't eaten yet.
I will say this, in the last 3 years, we've had years where all of a sudden things have changed very dramatically, either for the better or the worse, just seemingly out of nowhere. And people who were, for example, waiting for prices to drop farther and farther and farther were just shocked when they suddenly shot up. And likewise, we've had years where everything seemed to be going just great, and all of a sudden it fell off a cliff very quickly. And we've had, in the last 30 years, we've had 3 instances in Vancouver of prices dropping 25% or more from a peak. So it's not as if prices always go up here, that's for sure. And with that, we are over our time. And I just
wanted to thank Jim and all the panelists. Thank you for being here this evening. And there will be, and thank you, Gordon and Peter, as well.